So, hello, my name is Peter Fenton. I teach psychology at your college, and I thought as a way of trying to introduce you to psychology, we would have a look at trying to use psychological principles, of which you have no experience of yet, so hopefully this will be interesting, to attempt to explain how a very unique human personality has come to develop over time. Um, One of the problems with a taster session for psychology is that unlike other subjects, you don't really have any grounding, and this is a very different sort of direction to most subjects are. So what we're going to try and do is explain an extreme personality. In the case we've picked out, Voldemort, the dark wizard from the Harry Potter series. I apologize if you're not a Harry Potter fan. Personally, I'm not a Harry Potter fan, but I do think Voldemort's an interesting character. And we're going to try and explain how he became the person he was. This is not a permanent state of mind. From the age of 11, he had showed some antisocial behavior. He was willing to hurt people if he felt he needed to, if he felt he wanted to. But at the age of 11, we've got a kid who's left in an orphanage who's struggling, and this would potentially not be that surprising, other than the fact that he obviously has magical powers. But moving on from that. By 14 years old, he started to display some really quite unusual behavior. He's willing to concede and kind of consider murder as a possibility for extending his life. On top of that, he's becoming cunning and manipulative. He's twisting his mentors and his teachers round to kind of fulfill his requirements without really telling anybody why, and without them really understanding why they're giving this information up. And this isn't because of magic, this is simply because of the way he manipulates people. By 16 years old, he has clearly gone off the deep end when it comes to his developing psychopathy. At this point, he has clearly rejected his humanity. He's incredibly grandiose. He believes that he's spectacularly more important than everyone else around him. And he's more than comfortable with the idea of being an object of fear and hatred if it allows him to be all-powerful. Now, the trick to this is to see that this is a development from an 11 to a 16-year-old boy. This is a 5-year period of time, which for some people, you might consider this to be, well, how on earth do you go from being just a little bit damaged to being quite extreme behavior in just 5 years? And that's what we're going to try to explain today, how psychology and psychological principles can link things together. And there can be multiple different reasons for this behavior forming, but just how we piece it together. And hopefully, as we go through, understand a little bit more about what psychology is all about. So, the adult Voldemort character, I think this is one of the scariest quotes you'll ever find in a children's book. I don't turn your back on me, Harry Potter. I want you to look at me when I kill you. I want to see the light leave your eyes. I haven't read things as cold as that in adult horror. I mean, this is a brutal, brutal statement, directed at a child, no less, by an adult. So this is quite a turnaround. This is not a person who is dealing with their life experience in a way that maybe you and I would do. So, he's a raging psychopath. This is actually taken from J.K. Rowling's own words. She described him as being devoid of normal human responses to other people's suffering, whose only ambition in life is to become all-powerful and immortal. This is quite a big deal. He loves hurting people. He has no remorse. He feels no conscience for his behavior. He doesn't understand love or affection or human companionship, and he believes he's superior to everyone around him, frequently referring to himself in the third person. Now, in many ways, you might be excused for thinking that this is a little bit of a stereotypical view of your average psychopath. And partly that's due to the fact that J.K. Rowling has taken parts of his personality from a clinical diagnosis of what psychopathy psychoticism, actually is. Psychopathy tends to be one word for it, but there's a lot of psychoticism is just another word for it. It's all the same thing. So this is referred to as the psychopath checklist. Essentially, what this is describing is a number of different facets you had to demonstrate to be classed as a psychopath. So we've got things like glibness and superficial charm. We've got grandiose self-worth. This is kind of believing that you're kind of really important and more important than everyone around you. Pathological lying, you can't help yourself. Cunning and manipulative. Lack of remorse. Shallow affect, that means that you have very minimal emotional reactions. They're very simplistic. Callous and lack of empathy, feeling no empathy for the people around you. Failing to accept responsibility for your actions. It's always somebody else's fault. Prone to boredom, parasitic lifestyle. That's quite funny because if you've read the books, he actually spends some time glued to the back of someone's head. Lack of realistic long-term goals. That's not fair in his case, but still. Impulsivity, clearly. Irresponsibility, clearly. Poor behavioural controls, early behavioural problems, juvenile delinquency, criminal versatility. The simple truth of the matter is the Voldemort ticks almost every single box, which is probably an extreme example of psychopathy and a little bit caricatured in fairness. Not everyone ticks all these boxes and they fit into being classed as developing psychopathic tendencies. But still, it makes the point we're trying to make. So how does a 11-year-old boy turn into what we're describing as a psychopath? What are the reasons? So first of all, let's have a look at the evidence that we have. First things first, Voldemort's family tree is very interesting. He descends from Salazar Slytherin, he's a guy who hid a massive murderous snake in a school. So not a good chap to start off with. His immediate family both went to prison, to Azkaban, for murdering muggles and for violence against muggles. There is an implicit feeling that Voldemort's mother was abused by her brother and her father in incestuous relationships, so really grim. Voldemort's father, Tom Riddle Sr., as it were, came from an aristocratic family, and he only actually had a relationship with Merope Gaunt, his mother, simply due to the fact that she basically drugged him. And as soon as he found out he'd been drugged, he ran off and abandoned his destitute, as in very, very poor, pregnant wife, who then went on to die, giving birth to Tom Riddle, who becomes Voldemort. So the back history, there's a whole pile of weird stuff going on there. But you could argue, to a certain extent, that this could be part of the reason why he develops the way he does. Parents, specifically, as I said, so Tom Riddle was tricked into marrying through the use of a love potion, and he claims to have been hoodwinked and taken in by a local tramp's daughter. So clearly, he was not a nice guy and quite easily abandoned her without any particular effort. Mother was squalid and lived in kind of squalor and was abused by her family, who was homeless in London, loads of abuse, family abuse, died in childbirth, and she wouldn't save her own life. There's an interesting point there. She probably could have done, but she didn't save her own life. She allowed herself to die, which effectively is abandoning her child. Early childhood, Voldemort was brought up in Wool's orphanage, where he was rejected and neglected for much of his younger life, and became nasty and kind of vicious because he felt rejected by society. He goes to school at Hogwarts, and interestingly, he gets put in Slytherin House, which, when you think about it, it's a very strange concept. Why would you create a house where everyone with some slightly dubious personality traits are put together to allow them to scheme? I would not set that up in my own school, but I didn't create this. Either way, he's put into a situation where all his worst character traits are encouraged, and he becomes aware that he's descended from Salazar Slytherin. He starts to imitate some of this behavior because, of course, he's looking for some sort of lifeline to hold on to. It's also notable that at this point, once he realizes that he's descended from Salazar Slytherin, he then kills his father and his entire paternal family straight away after learning about his maternal history. Adult life is very sketchy, but this is a direct quote: travelled far and wide, sank deeply into the dark arts, consorted with the very worst witches and wizards, and underwent many dangerous magical transformations in his quest for power and immortality, and returned as Voldemort. So it's safe to say he was hanging out with a pretty bad crowd. Social environment there clearly has an impact. There's some other stuff too that people don't often think about. So, for example, Dumbledore is kind of given the information, is made privy to one of the worst things as far as Voldemort is concerned, and that is death. He is terrified of dying. He almost thinks that dying is not only something he wants to avoid, like most people would do, he sees it as a shameful human behavior, something that should be avoided, something that magicians shouldn't have happen to them. He has this kind of, it's moving into the realms of kind of a pathological issue with this idea of death. So it's not so much that he fears dying, is that he fears being branded as human. Humans die, therefore death is shameful, which is quite a complex thought process. So based on this evidence, there is essentially 5 possible explanations that psychology could present to explain how he ends up being the way he is. And these all play into something that in psychology we call the approaches. So we're aware in psychology that any behavior we're trying to explain is highly complicated. So what we have to do is look at it from multiple different perspectives. Sometimes this is because different psychologists have very strong points of view about how you should actually explain human psychology, and sometimes it's because different people are looking at different facets of the same thing, different sides of the same coin, as it were. It depends entirely on your perspective. It is not uncommon for them to disagree with each other, which is worth considering. So the first one we're going to look at is a biological approach, and this is playing into the idea of genetics and brain damage. So he has a history of violence and arrogance. There is a family history of this kind of racist, aggressive, abusive, unpleasant kind of behavior. And it could be argued that this then is due to some sort of genetic trait. We know that certain characteristics are passed through via genetics, and maybe this inbred aristocratic family on both sides, on the Muggle side and on the human side, has just led to these traits being kind of built into people's genetic code. That idea seems a little surreal, but actually the idea of there being memories and behaviors built into your genetic code is becoming more credible, with things like instinct being explained genetically. On top of that, he's gone through loads of magical mutations. You just have to look at his face. And hell, if you haven't read the books, the films are downplaying it. He looked weird. And that is because of experimenting with magic. Now, if your outside looks as strange as his does, it bears out that potentially his brain could have changed shape too. And we know that brain damage is associated with a number of problems. So biologically, there's a fairly strong explanation as to how he could have ended up developing these problematic behaviors. Now, the behavioral approach argues that all your behavior is learned through experience and that there's nothing really built in. So this is a very different way of looking at it. So classical conditioning, which is the traditional idea which states that we associate things together in our head, argues that because he has been abandoned by his father, he associates muggles, humans, with weakness and rejection. And due to that being reinforced, as it were, by being rejected in an orphanage later on in his life, he associates humans with weakness and rejection. So they're one thing in his head. Hence his dislike for human beings. A lot of that is quite easily identified. That's where his prejudice comes from, because they come together in a box in his head. There's also something that's referred to as negative reinforcement, where operant conditioning argues that if you are encouraged to do something, you will do it again. That's positive reinforcement. That's how you teach a dog to sit. Humans do the same thing. Negative reinforcement is a more complicated view of that, and it argues if you're going through bad experiences, and the bad experience is taken away by something, whatever you did to take that away will be repeated. So bullying is a good example of this. Bullies often have low self-esteem. They don't like themselves. When they bully somebody else, it makes them feel not as bad about themselves, so they repeat it. So it takes away their feelings of being inadequate, and therefore they repeat the bullying behavior. Negative reinforcement, taking something away which encourages a behavior. So in this case, by punishing those around him, it reinforces him, it makes him feel powerful, which reduces his feelings of weakness. Positive reinforcement, he gets put in Slytherin House, and all of his bad character traits get encouraged, like teaching a dog to sit. Anytime he does something that is arrogant or power grabbing or unpleasant or racist, he gets rewarded by the people around him, positively reinforced. Do it again, aren't you fantastic? Because the people around him think that behavior is great. On top of that, there is social learning theory that argues that you imitate the people around you if you see them as role models or you want to be like them. Now, he has a very bad, weak, as it were, parental structure, but he discovers that Salazar Slytherin is one of his ancient relatives. And this is a strong, powerful character. So he aspires to be like him. He looks up to him, so he imitates his behavior. The cognitive approach is a bit more integrated. The biological and the behavioral approaches sometimes can be a bit separate. They shouldn't be, but that does sometimes happen. The cognitive approach is talking less about your biology or your behavior and more about how you are thinking. So there's two things that come into this. One of them is this idea of schemas. Now, a schema is like a knowledge package. So if I was to say the word dentist, you'd get a whole pile of images and thoughts, dental chairs, drills, whatever, that would pop up in your head. That's your knowledge package or schema for dentist. Now, the argument here is that he has a schema for being a wizard. And one of the things that is absolutely not in his schema is death. Wizards don't die. He has death and a human schema. He doesn't want to be one of them. So what you end up with is a strange sort of behavior that develops. He wants to avoid death because that doesn't fit with his view of what he is, his schema for wizard, and therefore he has and it's written on the side as IMP, internal mental process. That's another way of saying thought. So he has to create a Horcrux to stay alive. So he kills to create a Horcrux. But that normalizes killing. The idea is very simple. Once you've done it once, it's easier to do it again. So he kills again, which makes another Horcrux, which moves him further away from being a human who dies. And he keeps doing this, and it goes round and round, and you end up with this vicious cycle that just spirals and spirals and spirals. So he manages to move further and further away from death, this idea of being a human being, into being a powerful wizard who cannot die, because that's part of his schema of a powerful wizard. So his fear of death drives him to normalize killing, because being a powerful wizard is what he has to be. The psychodynamic explanation is a slightly different way of looking at things. This is an older psychological theory that came about from a person called Freud, who some of the things that he argues are a bit surreal and don't tend to be considered very much anymore, but there are some interesting ideas. So the first one is this concept of a phallic fixation. Now, according to the psychodynamic approach, you go through a number of different stages in your childhood development where you basically you derive pleasure from different things. So when you're a baby, you go through the oral stage where you are focused on your mouth. And there's 5 other stages. We'll talk about them next year. It's too much to go into at the moment. However, he argued that during the phallic stage, which is unfortunately how it sounds, during the phallic stage, you form your morals. You imitate them of your parent, your same-sex parent, in Freud's theory. So men would imitate their fathers and women would imitate their mothers. Whether you agree with that or not isn't important at this point, but that was the theory. Now, he argued that you imitate this morality from your same-sex parent as a way of avoiding conflict developing between you and them. Now, in Voldemort's case, there's an interesting problem here, because he doesn't deal with his father in that way. He doesn't avoid conflict by imitating his father's morality, his sense of right and wrong. He just kills his father, and in many ways imitates Salazar Slytherin's sense of right and wrong. Now, this argues that to a certain extent he develops, the technical term is a phallic fixation, but that basically just means that stage is a bit broken. And what this means is he doesn't have any values. He doesn't develop any of these attitudes, and he actually then falls back on what he has built into him. And Freud argued you're born with something he called the id, which is like your base drives. So this is your selfishness and your self-focus and your wanting to destroy things and all these kind of very selfish baby-like attitudes. If you think about it, babies aren't very nice. They just scream and want things right now, and if they could do things to take things off you, they would. They don't, it's not moral creatures. Some of your parents might not like me saying that, but it's true. Babies haven't learned to be moral creatures yet. They're just incapable of attacking you, therefore they're more likely to smile at you to try and get food. So can you imagine someone with a baby's personality but in a human body with huge amounts of power. In an adult body, not a human body, with huge amounts of power. This is a dangerous person. He has not developed his sense of morality. He's just driven by, I want, I want, I want, I want. And he's got the power to do stuff about it. So that would be the phallic fixation. That particular theory sometimes people don't like because it plays around with some of Freud's theories that are a little bit odd. However, displacement of hatred is a fascinating one because there is something that we know to be true called denial. Now, due to his abandonment by his father, he hates all muggles, but there's a problem in this because he is in fact also half muggle. His dad was a muggle. So he's in a situation where he actually hates who he is. And that's really difficult to do. It's very difficult to hate yourself. So what he does is instead of hating himself, he displaces it onto other muggles. Meaning not only does he hate himself, which he doesn't realize anymore, he's kind of blanked that out, he loathes non-wizards, and actually anyone who's not pureblood. There's an irony in that. He's not a pureblood, but he hates anyone who isn't a pureblood. And it's because of this displacement of hatred. He's moved his hatred from himself onto an easier target, which is everyone who doesn't fit his idea. This isn't an unusual thing. A good comparison of this would be Adolf Hitler, who claimed that the Aryan race was the master race, without noticing that he wasn't one. In fact, didn't tick pretty much any boxes for it. The same is true here with Voldemort. And because of that, it leads into denial. So he's not even really thinking about the fact that he's not a pureblood. It doesn't even register. He doesn't spend his days going, oh, I can't believe I'm not a pureblood. He blanks it completely. It's not even in his head. He denies it absolutely. He ignores the fact that he's the object of his own hate, which is a very powerful psychological principle. And we know that denial happens, and it's really hard to do anything about because people aren't willing to listen. The humanistic approach sees things in a very different way, and they try not to narrow things down to biology or genetics or thought processes or upbringing. And they tend to try and look at the person as a whole. So they would argue there's a couple of different factors that are playing into the development of Voldemort's kind of psychopathy. So they argue, first of all, is his inability to self-actualize. Now, self-actualizing is being able to reach your goals. Now, he can't. His goal is to be a pureblood. He's not capable of doing so. And because of that, there is a difference between what he wants to be and what he is, his self and his ideal self. It's referred to as congruence. And the bigger the gap between what you want to be, your ideal self, and what you are, yourself, the larger the incongruence becomes. And the bigger the incongruence, the more psychologically damaging that is. So there's that. On top of that, and this is one of those ones that plays quite nicely with, particularly with the Harry Potter story, is that he's never experienced any love. Now, humanists would argue for sound psychological development, you must experience unconditional positive regard. What that means is being loved without there being a reason for it. Now, he not only doesn't have that, I'd say conditional positive regard, where you are loved because you've done something. This can cause some problems. If someone feels that you'll only love them if you work really hard or something along those lines, that can be problematic. But he hasn't even experienced that. He has no love, which causes a massive distance with other people, a complete lack of social network, and never really manages to stabilize his personality. He never feels safe. He never feels trusted. He never feels that relationships are a thing he can do. He doesn't understand relationships. He doesn't understand love, simply due to the fact that he's never experienced it himself, which is considered to be a very, very big deal when it comes to psychological development, particularly in children, from the humanistic perspective. Overall, what we find is that there's multiple different factors that can actually go towards explaining how someone could develop these personality traits. And we've looked at 5 different explanations. A biologically based genetic legacy, prejudice formed through poor childhood experience, which would be a behavioral explanation, fear of death driving his behavior, which would be a cognitive explanation, displacement of hatred coupled with denial, which would be a psychodynamic explanation, and then the inability to self-actualize, and lack of unconditional positive regard, which would be a humanistic explanation. So 5 different approaches to explaining the same person's personality issues. And there we go. If you found this at all interesting, then I would encourage you to take psychology at A level. It's a fascinating subject. Just be aware that you will have to think outside the box. You'll be able to have to write essays, and you will need to think more than just expecting to be given the facts. But if that sounds at all interesting for you, please feel free to drop an email to peterfenton@yorkcollege.ac.uk. It's actually pfenton@yorkcollege.ac.uk, or the admissions team or anyone in the college, and they'll happily put you through to have a chat about studying A-level psychology next year. Thank you for your attention. I hope this has been interesting for you, and have a good evening.